Before the Roman legions marched eastward, the Balkans were already a world alive with movement, power struggles, and shifting borders. This land, stretching from the Adriatic coast to the Carpathian Mountains, and from the Aegean shores to the Danube frontier, was not a backwater. It was a crossroads, a meeting point of cultures, traders, and warriors. The mountains, rivers, and valleys created natural divisions, but also corridors of movement where tribes and kingdoms rose, clashed, and disappeared into memory. In the west, along the rugged Adriatic coast and deep inland valleys, lived the Illyrians. They were not a single nation, but a patchwork of tribes, seafarers, mountain warriors, and raiders who controlled trade routes and challenged even the Greek city-states. To the east, the lands of Thrace stretched wide, home to dozens of clans and tribes, each with their own kings, warriors, and myths. They were known for their ferocity, their horses, and their cults of wine and ecstasy that later fascinated the Greeks. Farther north, beyond the Danube and into the Carpathians, lived the Dacians. Their hill forts, high on ridges, made them seem untouchable, and their reputation as fearless fighters would one day bring them into direct conflict with the greatest emperors of Rome. In the central Balkans were the Paeonians, often overshadowed by their more famous neighbors, yet they too had kingdoms, kings, and alliances that shaped the balance of power. And then there were the Macedonians, who before Rome and before Alexander's empire were themselves seen as semi-barbarian outsiders by the Greeks. Yet from these rugged lands, a kingdom would rise that briefly united the Balkans under one banner and stretched its power all the way to India. But before that glory, before the organized power of Rome or Macedon, the Balkans were defined by tribal warfare, piracy, migrations, and myths. It was a world where alliances were fragile. Kings often fell to rivals within their own tribes, and survival depended on strength, cunning, and the land itself. To understand what Rome encountered when it first looked east, we must step into this pre-Roman Balkans, a place of forgotten kingdoms, warrior tribes, and cultures that shaped the very foundations of European history. The Illyrians dominated much of the Western Balkans, from the Adriatic coast deep into the mountains. Unlike a centralized kingdom, they were a mosaic of tribes, each with their own chiefs and customs. Some lived as highland herders, moving with their flocks, while others turned their eyes to the sea, becoming feared sailors and pirates. Their diversity was both their strength and their weakness. It gave them adaptability, but made it difficult to unite under one rule. The Greeks knew the Illyrians well, often through conflict. From their strongholds along the coast, Illyrian tribes launched raids on Greek colonies like Epidamnus and Apollonia. Their fast ships struck without warning, plundering trade routes across the Adriatic. This piracy became so bold that even the rising Roman Republic would one day be forced to intervene. But piracy was only one part of Illyrian life. Inland, the tribes controlled fertile valleys and important overland trade paths that linked the Adriatic with the Danube and the interior Balkans. Whoever controlled these passes controlled wealth and influence. The Illyrians were also skilled warriors. Archaeological finds reveal iron weapons, helmets, and distinctive curved swords. They fought in close combat, often relying on ambushes in their rugged mountain terrain. Neighboring powers learned to fear their raids, but also to respect their resilience. The Illyrian highlands produced tough fighters who could not easily be subdued. When united under powerful rulers, such as King Bardilis in the 4th century BCE, the Illyrians became a serious threat even to Macedon. Bardilis managed to defeat Macedonian kings, and for a time made the Illyrians one of the dominant forces in the Balkans. But power in the Balkans was rarely permanent. After Bardilis, other tribes rose and fell. The Illyrian kingdoms remained fragmented, and though they produced strong leaders and fierce warriors, unity never lasted long. This left them vulnerable to stronger, more centralized states like Macedon, and later, Rome. Still, their influence stretched far. Illyrian mercenaries served in Greek armies, their reputation for toughness spreading across the Mediterranean. Their pirates challenged major powers on the seas, and their mountain strongholds stood as reminders that even in an age of rising empires, not every people could be easily conquered. The Illyrians embodied the spirit of the Western Balkans before Rome, fiercely independent, unpredictable, and dangerous to those who underestimated them. They were not a footnote, but a constant presence shaping the politics, trade, and warfare of the region. If the Illyrians ruled the rugged west, the east belonged to the Thracians. Spread across a vast territory from the Aegean to the Danube, they were not one people, but a collection of tribes, each with its own leaders and traditions. What united them in the eyes of outsiders was their reputation for fierceness, music, and myth. Greek writers often portrayed Thracians as wild, sometimes barbaric, yet also deeply spiritual. They were known for worshipping gods connected to wine, ecstasy, and the underworld. In fact, the cult of Dionysus, later adopted by the Greeks, may have had its roots in Thracian beliefs. Thracian warriors were prized as mercenaries. They carried distinctive curved swords called sika and fought with a mix of cavalry and light infantry that could harass and outmaneuver heavier forces. Their horsemanship was especially famed, with Thracian cavalry serving in armies across the Mediterranean. Yet despite their martial skill, the Thracians, like the Illyrians, rarely achieved lasting unity. Tribal rivalries and shifting loyalties weakened them, even as their land remained a rich prize for stronger powers. To the north, the Dacians carved out a reputation for themselves in the Carpathian Mountains and beyond the Danube. They were close cousins of the Thracians, but developed a distinctive identity. Dacian fortresses, built high on hills, became centers of power and defense. They were skilled in metalwork, producing not only weapons, but also intricate jewelry that reflected both wealth and artistry. Their culture mixed toughness with refinement, and their warriors, known for their courage, would one day challenge the might of Rome itself under King Decebalus. But long before that, they were already feared by their neighbors, seen as unpredictable raiders who could descend from the mountains with devastating force. In the central Balkans, between the Illyrians, Thracians, and Macedonians, lived the Paeonians. Their story is less well known, but they were far from insignificant. Paeonian kings ruled fertile valleys along the Axios River, and their lands were both a battleground and a bridge between greater powers. Sometimes allied with Macedon, sometimes resisting, the Paeonians were caught in the ebb and flow of Balkan politics. Their cavalry earned respect, and they played their part in the endless game of alliances, wars, and survival. Together, the Thracians, Dacians, and Paeonians show the extraordinary diversity of the Balkans before Rome. These were not empty lands waiting for conquest, but places alive with culture, warfare, and myth. Each people left their own mark. Thracians with their gods and warriors, Dacians with their mountain fortresses, Paeonians with their crossroads kingdom. They remind us that the Balkans were already a world in motion, long before imperial armies arrived. Amid this world of tribes and shifting kingdoms, one power rose to dominate the region: Macedon. At first, the Macedonians were seen as semi-barbarian outsiders by their Greek neighbors to the south. But under kings like Philip II, they transformed into a military powerhouse. Philip reorganized the Macedonian army into a disciplined machine, centered on the phalanx with its long sarissas. He used diplomacy, marriage alliances, and brutal campaigns to bring neighboring peoples under his control. For the Illyrians, this meant constant clashes. Philip crushed several Illyrian tribes, breaking their hold over Macedonia's borders and expanding his kingdom north and west. The Paeonians were also subdued. Their independence eroded as Macedon absorbed their lands. Thracian kings, too, found themselves forced into uneasy alliances or outright submission. By the time Philip's son Alexander the Great came to power, Macedon stood supreme, not just over Greece, but across the Balkans. Alexander's campaigns would take him far beyond the Balkans, into Asia and beyond. But the foundation of his empire was built here, on the conquest of the very tribes that had long guarded the region. The Illyrians, Thracians, Paeonians, and others became both foes and allies, providing troops, cavalry, and mercenaries for Macedonian armies. The Balkans became not just a frontier, but a launchpad for empire. Yet Macedon's dominance did not last forever. After Alexander's death, his successors struggled to maintain control, and the tribes of the Balkans once again asserted themselves. The Dardanians harassed Macedonian borders, Thracian kings carved out new domains, and Illyrian pirates roamed the Adriatic unchecked. The Balkans returned to its old rhythm, fragmented, warlike, and fiercely independent. But a new power was stirring to the west, Rome. What began as distant conflicts in the Adriatic, Roman fleets battling Illyrian pirates, would turn into full-scale wars of conquest. By the 2nd century BC, the Balkans were no longer just a frontier between tribes and kingdoms. They had become the next great battlefield for an empire that would stop at nothing to expand. Before Rome, the Balkans were already a land of warriors, kings, and cultures with deep traditions. The Illyrians, Thracians, Dacians, Paeonians, and Macedonians shaped this region with their struggles and their myths. Rome would eventually conquer them, but the memory of their power has never been erased. They were the first guardians of the Balkans, and their legacy still lingers in the mountains, rivers, and forgotten ruins of Southeast Europe.